How's it going, folks? I hope you're doing well wherever you're tuning in from. David here for this week's Griscom stream. Always happy to be back. We had a really nice time in New York City, and thanks everyone so much for showing up. Matt got home fine, if anyone was worried. But really, it was really nice being able to chill with everybody and seeing everyone's face. It was a lot of fun. I think it was a pretty successful show. So if you missed it, keep your eye out for the next one. We're trying to line up some spots. Be curious to hear what people think. I mean, it's really nice to be able to do those pack shows, but I do think, at least for now, we're sort of limited in our ability to do like a 250 person like audience show in some of the cities that we want to be going to. So I don't know, maybe we could do smaller meetups in different towns, maybe more frequently, but we'll just see if we can figure out how to do that. But yeah, folks, and also just a quick reminder to people, anyone who got any of our beautiful Left Reckoning merch, I think the orders are being sent out. Just a reminder, you can get all that at the leftreckoning.com/store. You can get our trucker hat, Big Tech's tank, or the LR on the road shirt. And we're also doing a promotion for the live show, but extend that to all of y'all too. 15% off if you put in the code "left is best." So grab that this weekend. I think it's when that's going to expire. But sorry, I got a little cold. Not COVID. I'm feeling fine, but my voice is a little spent. But everybody, welcome this week's show. I mean, for folks who are new, always trying to hang out and see what y'all are saying in the chat. So happy to talk about a couple different things. So feel free to jump in at any time with any questions or topics or things you might want to hear me discuss. It's been a while. I mean, I was back, I think, briefly last week, but I've been sort of focused on getting this live show, and then I was on vacation. So nice to get back in the swing of things. We got some really cool guests coming up in February. We're going to have Madison Hilly from the Green Nuclear Deal project to come and talk about the progressive case for nuclear power in the next couple of weeks, which I'm really looking forward to. And next week's main show, we're going to be joined by none other than the man himself, Matt Huber, who's been a huge influence on me and my thinking about building working class politics, but also how we can find ways to deal with climate change that are also improving people's lives instead of the way that sometimes the green left talks about these questions. So always great to have him on. I think we're going to be doing a Reconstruction episode. I think we're going to have Nando on to talk about his new podcast, Shoot the Messenger, sometime in February. I think we're going to do something on Reconstruction. I might just said that. Potentially something on Vietnam. I mean, we got a pretty full list coming up for the next few weeks. So stay tuned in to Left Reckoning to get all of that. But yeah, folks, let's think. Because I have this big story about the Fed that I definitely want to talk about. But I'd be happy to maybe take some questions off the top. And while people are getting those in, I did want to talk about something just because I find it pretty funny. Forgive me, it's a little indulgent. But the right wing has been fixated on masculinity for a little bit now, and how the left is softening boys, and what happened to the real strong men out there. But when you really think about what political movement has had more of a negative effect on young people and masculinity in the general sense, or I would argue hopefully more in the positive sense, it has to be the right. I mean, they are creating a bunch of really whiny, weak-minded, and soft folks. And we've been doing these TikTok videos. I don't know if people have been checking out the Left Reckoning TikTok. We also put them on our Instagram and Twitter. But we've been putting out these shorter videos, which are great because we can reach different kinds of audiences. But it's been really funny to sort of swim in those waters and interact with some of these different folks. So this is from this is a short that we made from an episode a couple of weeks ago. I'm just going to play it so we're all on the same page here, because some of the responses we've got from these right wingers have really been cracking me up. But I'll just play this, and again, feel free to jump in with any questions or anything like that you'd like to throw in.
if we're going to build electric cars, he seems to be the best at that. He more or less did that by himself.
He's not going to really insult Elon. He's going to elaborate the myth of the guy.
Tesla has been in a lot of trouble. I think a lot of investors are recognizing the fact that the other car companies are able to produce more and better cars.
The big boys are coming to eat, and his little fancy boutique tech operation that was selling to investors shit's over.
Why, though, has it been hit so hard? Well, it's been because of his antics.
This is around the time the CEO started doing things on Twitter. Money allows bullshit to defy gravity, but only so long.
And then he built a rocket at like 1/10 the price of NASA rockets.
NSF Live with us yesterday. Oh, hey. Whoa. Whoa.
Better than NASA could do.
There have been significant allegations of extreme worker abuse at his factories. What he's doing to South Texas has been absolutely despicable. Literally burning down wildlife for his vanity projects that don't work and using the power of the state to harass activists and people who challenge. So yeah, I mean, look, the Tesla Musk stuff, there's a lot to talk about. And of course, the only thing that even his right-wing fans want to talk about is Twitter, which, even to the anger of some of our own audience. I mean, we've covered with Bronco, we've talked about the stuff that we think is silly, but we've also talked about some of the, aspects of Twitter's former administration, particularly the, involvement of the United States government in trying to influence who's getting reach and who's being silenced on Twitter, and said that's a bad thing. So, you're not going to get too much argument for me on those things. But I wanted to focus on that last bit here, because that's been the stuff that has been cracking me up with some of these right-wing commentators, is about the working conditions of Musk's workers. And, for people who've been watching the show, if people who've been just sort of generally aware of what happens at his companies, Musk runs really brutal factories, where workers are threatened. He's been trying to, bust and stop unions from forming at his Tesla factories for a long time. He fled the state of California because of the worker abuses that he was doing there, including, extreme racism. I mean, almost comical is the wrong word, but just amazing how intense and pervasive the racism at his factories were in California. He ran away from California, not because he likes Texas or anything like that, because he thought he could get away with that shit here. And when it comes to his new Gigafactory, his shitty truck factory here, it's already started. And as we've covered on the show, workers who were building that factory were put in situations that were extremely unsafe, where they're handing out fake safety certificates to workers. So people weren't even getting the training needed to operate the machinery they were using to, engage in safe practices while building this factory. And cherry on top, wasn't paying people. So I bring that up because, we'll put that out there. And I don't know. Look, I get that there's people who don't see the world like I do. I think what we try to do on this program is try to reach people and maybe try to shift their perspective and all this kind of stuff. What I've never understood is how you can, consider yourself to be somebody who's a friend of working people or a working person yourself, and be a right winger in the way that, like, a lot of these kind of people who've been getting really mad at us on these videos have been. Because one of the arguments we get a lot from folks when we mention the fact that Musk is, being a awful boss and not paying his workers, put them into dangerous situations, they'll say something like, well, are they forced to work there? Why don't they just get another job? My first response to that is like, you're the first person I want to rob, right? If you're going to make excuses for a thief, you're a pretty easy mark. But beyond that, again, like the rights, the left's filled with soy boys, all these weak folks, right? You're literally saying here that if you're working a job and some guy says, I'm not going to pay you, your first reaction is to be like, oh, I'm just going to walk away. I'm not going to fight to make sure that I get paid. I'm not going to fight to make sure that I get compensation for the abuses that I faced, right? I mean, that's just such a weak mentality position that is propagated from all of these folks in right-wing media, and then from, the vast majority of that audience. And look, again, I know I'm not going to be able to convince everybody on everything. that we think. But I think it's a pretty basic thing that if you work a job, you should be expected to be paid for it. And any kind of person who's making excuses for somebody, saying, "Oh, well, you shouldn't stop crying." No one's crying; they're fighting back. They're suing. They're using the legal means that they have to fight back and get those wages back. Right? I don't know. It's just like, I'm not sympathetic to a lot of conservative arguments, but at least I can understand in a certain kind of logic where they live. This kind of like just blatant bootlicking, cowardly mentality is something that always amazes me whenever I hear it. It really is like it's amazing for a group of people who's always talking about how the left's so weak, the left's whiny, all they do is cry. But then they see working people fight back. You see working people try to form unions. You see working people using the legal means in front of them to make sure that one of the wealthiest people in the world pays them for their work. Um, their only answer to that is not, yeah, it's right. They should, that's a manly value, right? To stand up for yourself, stand up for your family, make sure that you're getting paid for the work that you do. But for the right, I guess it's cowardly. And, I think that when you really get down to a lot of conservative politics in the U.S. these days, it's some of the most weak shit out there. I'm trying to think of nice words to say. It's really weak stuff, from saying that, yeah, if somebody screws you over and doesn't pay you for a job, you should just walk away and forget about it and let them get away with that shit, right? Weak-minded mentality. Or the other thing that, like, American cities right now are the scariest part of the country. Places where millions upon millions of people live, right? Big tough guy can't walk down the streets of New York or even walk down the streets of Austin, apparently. It's just, that's just my open rant. It's just truly amazing to me how for all of the bravado you get from these folks, how soft-handed, soft-minded, and weak-willed a lot of these boys are at the end of the day. Let's see what's going on in the chat. I'd be happy to take some questions and get to this Fed story as well. Danarchist says, my first question is, the right needs to define what strength is. Well, I mean, like in these contexts, I guess strength is sitting around trying to ride on the coattails of other people's wealth and power, and thinking that makes you a tough guy. Again, like, same thing. Like, this is more of a personal thing, but I was chatting with Matt for the week last week when we were hanging out together, and I was saying to him, it's like, it's, again, like, dropping even the politics in terms of like being a tough guy, being strong-willed. There's nothing weaker to me than being born into a society like the one that we have, and deciding that like the real virtue is standing up for the status quo and not trying to fight to better your life, to better your family's life, to better your class's life. Again, it's probably not the thing I should be spending too much time thinking about when it comes to all the things that the right wing does, but it truly is amazing, I think, to me, how whiny and weak they are. And on the nuclear stuff, we'll have that in 2 weeks, a whole episode. We've had Lee on. I'll tell you just off the top, I really want to be worried about the water cooling stuff. It's pretty simple mechanism to do that. And, the systems we have now are great. And, they're also developing new kind of nuclear reactors that actually use airflow instead to cool spent nuclear rods. But we'll have a whole episode on that coming up soon. And again, like, yeah, the Musk stuff is beyond whiny too, because, yeah, Musk didn't build anything. He purchased his way into companies and then marketed his way to turn into a brand. Absolutely. And when it comes to his stuff, Elon's hoping to be able to get away with it in Texas. Not if I and other groups here have anything to say about it. And let's see. I'm happy. I'm taking some questions and hearing what you are saying. And Seth says, it's true. There's an awful lot of projecting coming from the right. It's so much projecting. Look, these are, they're not sending their best. I think it's the easiest way to put it. And as Jordan, and thanks so much, Jordan, for all of your help last week. It's good to see you. Jordan says, strength is vulnerability. Whining and weeping is strength. Just ask Jordan Peterson. Yeah, that's the other funny thing is that they're, they're examples of masculinity are people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, who can't get through a sentence without crying, or even Steven Crowder, who has had an incredible amount of health issues for such a young man. Well, unless we have any questions or anything like that, we can get to this Fed story because it goes along with this stuff. This is a pretty fascinating document that we have over here. And again, if you have any questions that are off topic or whatever, you feel free to throw them in. I'll scroll back up after we finish the segment to take some at the end. How about that? This is a pretty fascinating. This is a pretty fascinating document that we have here. This is something that excuse me. This is something from Tim Barker, who got this document through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, and it's a document from Janet Yellen, who not even trying to get into all this kind of stuff, but there was this weird love affair that liberals were doing with her for a while. I mean, this is somebody who spent most of their career in the Federal Reserve, in the Board of Governors. Somebody who's been behind a lot of really nasty economic policy that has hurt working people. And this document is just truly fascinating because it's one of those things where we all have our suspicions and our understandings. We make the argument on the left all the time that the capitalist class understands the system in oftentimes similar ways as we do. They just sort of line up on the opposite side. And this document from 1996 really highlights it. So before we get into the text, I do want to just make sure I'm shouting out one Tim Barker, who's got this through FOIA from a FOIA request. You can read their piece at their Substack, Origins of Our Time, Empathy, Economics, and Social Class. And also there's a great write-up. I highly suggest reading this because it really breaks down the context and the kind of predominant economic theories that come from the Fed. This is from The Intercept by John Schwartz. In confidential memo, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen celebrated unemployment as a worker discipline device. But let's get into this just a little bit because this is a really fascinating piece here. So just to set the stakes a little bit for folks who might not be familiar, and I feel like I'm doing a throwback gem segment right now. For a long time, the predominant kind of macroeconomic theory from people who sort of govern our economy, from people who have a lot of influence and power, for example, in places like the Federal Reserve, is that if the unemployment rate gets too low, so if unemployment is low, so more and more people are employed, you have an ability to get a job when you need one, inflation is going to skyrocket. And we saw those arguments get played out again when we saw this massive inflation crisis towards the tail end of the COVID-19 lockdowns and very interventionist government policy. And they use this acronym called NARU, called non-accelerating inflation rate of employment, which is sort of the target goal of where they think that unemployment should be before it starts to create a massive amount of inflation and economic crisis. So again, remember that the Federal Reserve, from their own admission for a long time was looking at unemployment saying, we can't let too many people get employed because this is going to create fundamental problems in society. And they argue, the traditional argument is that means that more working people are going to have money in their pockets, which is going to drive up the price of goods. It creates inflation, which creates like a cascading effect in economic crisis. So step into this memo from Janet Yellen, and this is quoting from the Intercept piece. She wrote this memo to give to Greenspan to basically support his argument, because Greenspan, despite the fact that he was this Ayn Rand, acolyte, was sort of not trying to push hard on unemployment for a period in the late 90s, which sort of went against this kind of conventional wisdom and understanding about unemployment. And this is quoting from an Intercept piece. Greenspan's rationale was not that higher inflation was okay, but rather, as he eventually explained, greater worker insecurity has made possible a healthy economic performance with both low inflation and low employment. This increased workers' insecurity, he believed, the increased worker insecurity, he believed, could be measured by surveys finding that in 1991, for example, in the middle of a recession, 25% of workers agreed with the statement, "I am frequently concerned about being laid off." Yet 5 years later, with far lower unemployment, 46% agreed. So just put that very simply for folks, what Greenspan is citing was that in the 90s, more people at a time outside of a recession were saying they were afraid of being laid off than they were saying during that recession. So he's arguing that in the 90s, something has shifted at the job site. Something has shifted in the workplace where workers, even though the economic conditions might be looking rosier from the sense of what the unemployment numbers were, from the sense of like what the GDP growth was, and the general sense of the economy, workers' confidence and workers' insecurity and fears were still very, very high and were in fact increasing. And incepts this Janet Yellen 1996 memo. And I'll just pull up and we'll just look at a few bits of the text for y'all. Let me pull it up for y'all here. And again, you could find this at Tim Barker's Substack, Empathy, Economics, and Social Classes. He was the one who snagged it, and also in this great write-up by John Schwartz. But this is from the piece, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. This is the Yellen Memo, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to y'all. I have some specific parts that we can go into. So from the intro here, she's saying that the arguments in this paper show why an increase in job insecurity due to changing technology or other factors could induce a permanent decline in the natural rate of unemployment, along with a reduction in real wages and an increase in the markup of prices over labor costs. So let's go down just a bit and really get into the nuts of this argument here. So here we go. This is on page 3 of the text, if you follow along later. Additionally, improvements in the ability of firms to outsource production domestically or internationally would likely improve the bargaining power of firms relative to employees. Increased availability of alternatives to existing work arrangements, whether due to new labor-saving technology or declining transportation and communication costs that lower the barriers to domestic or foreign outsourcing, improves management's options and serves as a threat to workers. Even if management does not actually use these options, their availability lowers workers' bargaining power. An increase in profits at the expense of compensation would be the expected result. Lower unemployment benefits or decreased unionization could similarly result in a decline in workers' bargaining power. So again, what she's arguing here is that we've entered into a new phase in the management of capitalism, that despite, what the kind of more traditional arguments were, that if you get unemployment to a certain low rate, that, there's going to be inflation, it's going to create crises in the system, that because workers' confidence is so low, because work is so precarious, because people are afraid of losing their job, the ability to keep wages down and prevent this kind of inflation that they're very worried about is less so, right? So that actually the kind of conflict between capital and labor, right, bosses and workers, has become so lopsided that the Federal Reserve and macroeconomic policy can actually stay in certain ranges and keep unemployment at a lower level without this kind of threat of systemic collapse. And let's just remember a couple quick things here. One, the traditional argument is disgusting if you think about it, that the people who are the stewards of the economy are saying we need a certain percent of the population to be unemployed. And let's just, using Marxist understanding for a second, get what they're talking about. There is what's called the reserve army of labor, right, in Marx's conception. And it's a class of workers, people who are sort of in and out of the workforce, people who are unemployed, people who are searching for jobs, and also people who are sort of cycling in and out of work. What is their role in the class struggle? they are used to drive down wages for employed workers, because the threat is always this, that if you lose your job, there's a potential that you're going to have a long period of unemployment where you're going to struggle, you're going to go hungry, your family's going to suffer. So you better not make too much of a stink at work. You better not do, this is the kind of same shit we were opening up with all these right-wing whiny boys who are saying that workers shouldn't fight for better wages or even to get fucking paid. Because if you stand up, you could get smacked down and you could be, severely punished, not just at the workplace, but in the sense of losing your job. So the Federal Reserve for a long time saw its job as trying to manage unemployment, to keep a certain part of the population unemployed, so that they couldn't create this threat to capital. And look, if you talk to people, if you talk to, finance people, they'll tell you that, there's a real fear of, for example, approaching something like full employment, because it gives so much power to working people, because they can say no, something that a lot of working people feel like they can't, especially in the absence of unions in this country. So they might even prefer, for example, to give, a moderate to even medium-sized wage increase versus seeing the unemployment levels approach full employment, or virtual full employment, meaning that if you wanted a job, you could walk down the street and get one the same day. So the Federal Reserve for a long time saw its role as trying to manage this rate. And what Yellen and Greenspan are arguing is that in the 90s, something shifted under capitalism that actually made it so the threat of unemployment wasn't so great. They still don't want full employment, but they thought that, maybe we could go, if 6% used to be the kind of safe level of unemployment, we could maybe go down to even 3% without seeing these kind of threat to capital's power over working people, because of the fact that even for those workers who are employed, so many of them are in this kind of precarious, dangerous situation that they know if they lose their job, they probably won't be able to get a better one. Or the one that they'll get after this will be worse, or they'll be unemployed for a prolonged period of time. Going back to this text here, this is where it just gets absolutely explicit. In essence, let me pull this up for y'all. Sorry. In essence, unemployment serves as a worker discipline device, because the prospect of costly unemployment spell produces sufficient fear of job loss to motivate workers to perform well without constant costly supervision. In the turnover model, equilibrium unemployment limits voluntary quits and costly turnover to manageable levels. In the bargaining model, the prospect of a costly unemployment spell places limits on workers' ability to extract the firm's surplus. In each of these models, an autonomous increase in job insecurity at given unemployment rates permits a new equilibrium with lower unemployment and lower wage premium. In essence, an exogenous, which sort of means like coming from external factors, increase in job insecurity produces productivity enhancing changes in workers' behavior, mitigating the need for alternative controls on worker behavior through the channels of higher unemployment and higher wage premium. Alternatively, stated increased job insecurity makes it possible for firms to lower the wage premium they pay without suffering productivity reducing worker backlash. With lower wages, firms hire more labor and produce more output. Now, again, if you're just joining us, right, just want to remind folks, this isn't coming from a big criticism of capitalism. This is coming from inside the beast. This is coming from the managers of the system on the national level. And in many ways, the Fed operates on an international level. That's how they're talking. They're talking class war stuff, like very explicitly, that if we can keep things at this level, if we can take advantage of the lack of worker confidence, if we can take advantage of the fact that there's a smaller safety net, if we can take advantage of the fact that union density is lower, we can still do certain levels of macroeconomic activity that sort of pump money into the economy, and maybe in a more traditional model might improve the lives of working people, lower the rate of unemployment. We can do that because working people are stagnating. And these gains and the monetary policy that we're following is not going to pump money into working people's pockets. It's going to value the shareholders. And they also talk very Yellen, again, Janet Yellen, if you're just joining us, I know people come in and out of the stream. Janet Yellen, who's liberal darlings, but most of their career at the Federal Reserve, now is the Treasury Secretary, wrote this extremely explicit piece breaking down the way that the people in charge of our economy are thinking about it, and their goal is to keep working people down. And they're seeing that the advantage of not just technology, but the threat of technology, the damage of not just outsourcing, but the threat of outsourcing has been an incredible disciplinary tool to basically flip the script, and allow for capital to take larger and larger and larger shares of the value that is created by the people who actually work and produce the products and do the services and produce things, versus the kind of vampire class that just takes money off of the top. It's a really frightening document, to remember that this is 1996. And it's very arguable to look at the history of capitalism in the United States and a lot of other Western European countries and see a lot of similarities here. Whereas the power of working people has declined, the destruction of even like very moderate to minimal social safety nets has that destruction has increased. Working people are very worried about being able to stand up and fight back, and capital has taken full advantage of that. I mean, you've seen that in the levels of wage stagnation, and now it's it's interesting that it's coming back, because you did see a slight uptick during the COVID period, because you saw more people sort of standing up, you saw more people leaving jobs that they didn't like. That's by no stretch of the imagination was a permanent thing, or even some kind of signal that things were changing in the long term. But you saw this like little bit of an opening, and they went absolutely nuts at the Federal Reserve. Been pushing policies that are meant to basically cool and harm the economy and send us into a recession, because the Federal Reserve fundamentally is not interested in working for working people. They're fundamentally interested in maintaining the system that we have, maintaining the ability of the capitalist class to exploit working people as much as possible. And it's as clear as day. Class language, an understanding of your role. Really, the only difference for the most part is just the perspective is flipped. This is a good thing for Yellen. This is a good thing for the Federal Reserve. This is a good thing for shareholders. While for working people, it's a living nightmare. But I'm curious what y'all think. So I'm going to roll up to the top and try to take some questions and comments from y'all, and then I'll roll. But let's see. Okay, so going up to the very top, Dan Arcus says, why would a weak workforce help anybody? But remember, when we're talking about a weak workforce, we're not talking about productivity. In fact, they're saying that the productivity is increasing. What's weak about them is the ability of labor to bargain. And that's bolstered by the ability of capital to relocate. It's bolstered by the lack of union density, and it's bolstered by the war that was happening in the 90s on like the very, very minimal social safety net that we had in this country. I mean, this gets into a lot of factors and reminders of we talk a lot. Here's working people have this power, and it's the fundamental power, and it's the thing that keeps people like Yellen, is the thing that keeps up your boss, is the thing that keeps up the capitalist class in general up at night. If that the whole system is based upon the fact that working people go into work and they produce things that then get sold. And if working people start to pull back on that power, if they start to push back, utilizing that power by work stoppages, shutdown, strikes, capital can't grow. Capital doesn't get to make money, because capital needs the labor of working people to produce the things that they then sell and make money from. That's the power working people have, and it's a tremendous one. But the problem is that to do that, you have to be coordinated. If you just don't go into work, somebody takes your job, right? If 10 of you don't go into work, probably be a pain in the ass for the boss, but and it would lead to some consequences. But they might be able to replace you. Now, if the shop decides that they're going on strike, then they're in trouble. If a region decides that they're not going into work, then they're in trouble. If the class decides that they're going to start pushing back and demanding things, then they're in trouble, right? The problem is that to go from you as an atomized individual to operating as a class takes a lot of organizing, takes a lot of effort, right? And the goal of left socialist politics is to try to build up that capacity. The problem right now is we don't have that. So tremendous power that the working people have, but it needs a lot of coordination. It needs a lot of discipline to be able to build it. The capitalists have a tremendous amount of power right now. They can fire you, most states, for no cause. They can relocate. And remember, the freedom of movement of capital is a development that has really fundamentally shifted global capitalism. You see that internationally, and you also see it nationally. Think about like the increase in auto manufacturing from the more unionized Midwest to now the South, right? Think about all these plants that have come down to Tennessee and all these other southern states. They're coming there because they think that they can get away with more, and they're coming down there because union density is weaker. So capital's ability to just up and leave is a tremendous one that it has, right? And there's the fact the Federal Reserve operates in the capitalist class interest. Like the point is that working people have a tremendous amount of potential power, but until that gets organized and built up, capital has an incredible amount of weapons it can use in the near term. All right, let's see. Okay, Puta Donkinet, I hope I said that right, says the connection between unemployment and inflation is confusing to me. Well, there's a few things. One, the question about how attached these things are is open, right? And it's definitely overstated by the bosses. What they're more worried about is workers' power. But just to give you like their argument, so you understand what they're speaking to in the piece, the argument is that unemployment goes down. That means more people have jobs, right? Which means that there's more buyers, there's more people with income out there buying goods and services on the market. That creates a higher demand and the ability to pay that demand, which means that prices go up, right? If I'm selling, like, this is an example that Richard Wolff, has used a few times, I think makes sense. I have 5 ice creams. I sell them for $5 to 5 people, right? But let's say there's 50 people, then I could start charging, and I only have 5. Then I could start charging things like $20 for an ice cream cone. Most people are gonna say, I'm not interested in paying that. But there might be somebody who really, really, really wants that thing. So the ability of, sellers to be able to increase prices goes up when you have more buyers. And the idea is that, that's like a very general, small understanding of it. But like, the idea is like on a macro level, there's more money in the society, there's more money flowing in the society, so prices are able to go up, and that creates a kind of an inflation crisis. That's the general understanding that they're sort of operating from when they're saying that unemployment going down to a low level is really, really damaging. Emmy from ATX is howdy from ATX. Good to always hear from folks in town. Appreciate you. Bill Bradley has less of a question, but a good comment. Something that I think is a really important thing to remember is that the elites are not actually a monolith. If we don't see the divisions, we won't be able to take advantage of them. We, in fact, need those divisions. I totally agree. I think that, sometimes, there's nothing wrong with talking about the capitalist class, because the thing is that this class will operate in unison when necessary, because they understand their economic interests, right? So it's not wrong to think about the capitalist class in general as a whole. But in terms of like politics, in terms of strategy, industrial capital has like a very different has very different needs than finance capital. Different parts of industrial capital compete with each other and are fighting with each other. The whole Democratic Republican Party fight is a fight between different members of the capitalist class who have very, very different interests in the way that they want the government to distribute, resources and power and opportunity, right? So yeah, the capitalist class is not unified. You don't need an entirely unified capitalist class to operate. They understand their class interest, and yeah, I think it's definitely good to try to take advantage of those fights. I think that's something that oftentimes is missed. That there are different, there are different sections of capital, that are in competition with each other, that will succeed if some others fail. But I also think it's important not to make the mistake of sort of elevating one kind of capitalist over another. because they all sort of have the same fundamental goal at the end of the day. But totally strategically, you can definitely take advantage of the fact that they are in conflict with each other. Okay. Chief Running says, what is the incentive to continue the wealth gap? Is it about money anymore, or is it just a way to force labor to continue turning the cogs society relies on, or what is it? We got enough to go around. I mean, the wage gap is just a natural function. The inequality gap in this country is just a function of capitalism. I mean, no capitalist worth their salt is trying to say, I'm trying to take less money for what I'm doing. This is also like why, you hear these like mythologies like conscious capitalism or moral capitalism and all this kind of stuff. No. Where you can see this sometimes better understood is in small businesses versus large businesses. So, oftentimes when we talk about these things, we talk on a moral level, and we absolutely should. It's disgusting. But that moralism sometimes I think can force people, like encourages people to misunderstand the problem, right? Because like the problem is not solely that Jeff Bezos has like a bad heart, or solely that Elon Musk has a bad heart. I think they do. But it's that the system that they're in encourages and rewards them for participating in these kind of activities. And I think this is something you can see on a small business level more than anything. People go into small business and they say, I'm going to be a good boss. I'm not going to be a bad boss, but the tensions start to get a little bit harder when you're actually dealing with the practicalities. Are you going to pay yourself less money? Are you going to take less profit so that somebody else could be making, a decent amount of money off of, off of their labor, if not, close to the full value of the work that they put into your company, right? Are you interested in paying for benefits for them, like healthcare, if you don't have to? That means less money is coming into your house, less money is going to your check, less money is going into you to, invest in your business or to acquire new properties or expand. Those are where those tensions really start to play. And again, I don't say this to excuse people for it, but the fantasy is like, oh, the problem with capitalism is we have bad bosses. The problem with capitalism is it produces bad bosses because the way that the system functions is irrational. It creates destruction. It creates poverty. It creates unemployment. And that's how you operate a good business in the sense of making money, if that's what your goal is. And I'm not saying every single person who's in that situation makes the worst choice, right? There's this whole spectrum of things that you can do. But that's where that tension really resides. And I think understanding that, like, the critique of capitalism is so much more than just like, oh, it's just immoral that some people have so much and some people have so little. Don't get me wrong, that's there. But the bigger problem is like, it's immoral, it's wrong that the people who produce the things don't get to enjoy the fruits of that work. And that there's just this class on top that gets to, take advantage of the fact that all these other people are doing that kind of labor, and that it's a system that's prone to crisis because it always needs to continue growing. It always needs to continue expanding, which means that for one company to succeed, it means it needs to destroy production for all of it, for its opponents, right? Which creates crisis. And then the crisis of production. We talked about this. If you want to hear this more in depth, we had a whole thing on the show. We just released it from behind the paywall on Rosa Luxemburg's Reformer Revolution. There's the fundamental crisis of overproduction. So like there's these there are these like fundamental problems with capitalism where it's like there's the shop place problem where it's like people are being exploited in the sense that like they produce things and someone else is taking the lion's share of the value that's created there. And then there's the macro problems that because of the competition, because of the system that we're in, capitalism is prone to crisis. It's one of those things that's like, it's very on the dot. You can predict typically within every 10 years or so, there's going to at least be some form of a recession in capitalism. They call it the business cycle, in economics, right? But it's not a naturally occurring thing, nor a good thing. And the hope is that we could get away from a system that's so irrational, that creates waste and devastation for people. On top of the fact that just on the fundamental workplace dynamic, it's it's a dictatorship, and people are getting exploited. Um, Dragon Lady says, how to use your employees against themselves with office versus home hours to keep them from unionizing or force them to accept less wage increase for work from home. Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know this on the macro level, but I'm sure that one of the things is, like, I know people like working from home. I'm not saying your want to do that is wrong, but that's definitely something that can be very beneficial to a boss if they can say, well, yeah, well, this person is going to do the same job as you from home. We're also going to pay them $20,000 less. We'll pay them in another part of the country or even another part of the world where their salary is much lower, so it seems good to them, but would be bad for where you're living. They're good at being able to take advantage of these kind of things. I'm going to come back to Jay's question in just a second, if that's okay, just in case we have more of these that are on topic, so I don't have to jump back and forth. Who do they expect to buy, or should I say afford to buy their useless crap? Well, I mean, this is where finance capital has played a huge role, right? You expand credit to, I'll put that up for people who might not have read that as fast as me. Finance capital comes in to either extend credit to buyers, or to extend credit to the capitalist class that can sort of operate, um, you know, um, and continue to grow, even when the conditions like might not be sort of signaling to them that it's a time to ramp up more and more production. So finance capital, again, when if people are really interested in this kind of stuff, and I know sometimes it can be a little heady, but there's this whole thing that when finance capital started to really grow in its embeddedness in the capital system in the early 20th century, you even had socialists or people on the left who were saying, "Oh, well, capitalism is developing its way of out of crisis," because you see finance is able to play a role where whenever there's a kind of particular crisis, in like a drop in the price of a good, which typically would lead to a crisis of overproduction, where then like the ability of a capitalist enterprise and the profit collapses, and it can collapse precipitously, and end in mass layoffs and crisis. Finance capital is great because finance capital can come in and save the day and sort of fix these problems of the business cycle. But the problem with finance capital is it's not a solution. In fact, it actually embeds the entire system in in itself. And what I mean by that, it's like, think about the Great Recession that we all lived through. That was a crisis in subprime mortgages that became a global crisis. So rather than and the reason it became a global crisis is because all the financial institutions, excuse me, were attached and were exposed to these to these really, really bad package mortgages, and a lot of them failed, which meant that a lot of banks were having solvency issues, and meant that they had to restrict and contract their investment. At a time, that created a massive recession that cost so many people their jobs, their livelihoods, their homes. Right. So like finance capital, like the original idea is that, oh, it can sort of like clean, polish off some of the edges, deal with some of the problems that happen in a particular industry. What it ends up actually doing is connecting the entire system in a way that, like, a particular crisis in one region or one industry or one kind of financial product can become a global one at incredible speeds. And ironically, it's worse in the core, right? Like, it's worse in the countries that are more financialized than even the ones on the periphery, because everything there is so much more exposed. Okay. Anastasia, appreciate you being here. Anastasia says, Lefragan, thank you for the stream. I've never felt more pressed to learn about economics. Such a strange time in contrast to the rhetoric we grew up with. Overemployment, wages are too high. Yeah, I know. It's pretty perverse when you start to jump into these things and hear that there's a segment, and actually it's the most influential people in the system who are saying, yeah, we need to make sure that wages stay low, that unemployment stays at a certain level. It's pretty despicable shit. Let's see. Custodial artist is a friend of mine has been going on all day about how it makes no sense for big business to pay millions to not raise wages. He refuses to see the political implications. Well, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, but you'll see with big business, too, like, there's a little bit more willingness to increase wages, as long as it doesn't increase class power across the board. So, like, a marginal increase in Amazon can do a little bit of that. Amazon makes this argument all the time that, like, oh, well, our wage earners make a little bit more in this region than other places. But one, it's marginal. Two, oftentimes, it's not particularly accurate. But do some of these corporations have more ability to absorb a slight wage increase? They do, actually, and they in practice you have to push them all the way to the very fucking edge. But they're more worried, for example, about a union effort. Like, you see this with Starbucks right now. Starbucks is way more worried about a union effort than like a slight wage increase, because it's about wages. But they know in the long term the most important thing is power, and wages play a big role in that, right? Because it creates precarity, insecurity, all these other things. But they also want to be able to dictate and not have any kind of semblance of democracy within their systems. Which is why, expanding our conception. This is the difference between, like a socialist understanding of labor versus maybe like a progressive, is that a progressive is solely going to think in the context of wages, while socialists think about power that working people have, right? Like something like with sports unions, right? Like, I want to see professional athletes have more ability to say no, to be able to push back against their billionaire owners, even if they might make a salary that is unworldly to me. Because beyond it just being about, if you make this much wage, like, you're fine. These things are also about power. That's a fundamental criticism of capitalism as well. And like, just be very clear. It's like, obviously, the extent that you should get worried about somebody who's on the bottom end of the wage scale for somebody at the top, I think it's very reasonable to be able to hold your sympathies in line with that. But again, if we're trying to build a class movement, understanding that building more and more power, even for high wage earners, is in your benefit. And that's the thing is funny about, which is good. Sorry, is good about working class politics compared to like capitalist class politics, is that, like, for us, seeing increases and the improvement of other working people's lives and power is good for all of us. Versus capitalists, they want to see most of their opponents, destroyed or weakened. All right, let's see. I'll try to take a couple more. Tommy, good to hear from your friend. Says UW Seattle librarians are on strike with the SEIU. Solidarity with them. They're the 10th lowest paid librarians at one of the top best funded research universities. Been negotiating a contract for 18 months. Well, let us know if there's anything we can do to to push that out there. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's wild, and that's the thing too, is that when you heard that statistic during the Janet Yellen piece that we were talking about earlier, when you're hearing 46% of workers are, or sorry, it's Greenspan who was citing that in 1996, that 46% of workers were afraid of losing their job, that they wouldn't think they'd be okay if that happened to them. This extends all across the kind of wage spectrum, and more work that people might have sort of seen as like a nice solid middle class or upper middle class job is becoming more and more proletarianized, right? More and more people are being pushed into this precarious situation, which is why, like, sometimes I totally get like the cultural stuff, and that um there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get people in that kind of middle to upper income spectrum, to sort of see themselves as connected to the entirety of the working class. um but I think that we should be uh able to see, like, more militancy from middle to higher income earners is a good thing for everybody across the spectrum, because they're all in this fight together. And um, good note here from Tom. This is Paul Volcker. Volcker would carry a piece of paper with the latest average negotiated union pay rate. He loved it when it went down, and he said he was breaking the back of labor and a counter to inflation, a Federal Reserve tradition. Yeah, I mean, Volcker was a truly a ghoul. If people wanted to learn more about him, you can go on Left Reckoning, type in Paul Volcker. We've done some stuff on him well as on the Michael Brooks show as well in the past. All right, I'm happy to take these. And this is like, sometimes these topics can be a little hard to do stream wise, but I'm always happy to do it. In another industry, Kowalski, which was so nice seeing you in New York, brother. Says it's nice seeing farmers increasingly recognize Bill Gates for the threat he is, and Nebraskans seeing Buffett for the piece of shit anti-railroad goon that he is. Keep being evil oligarchs. I do think that's a good thing. Sorry if I'm missing any. There's just a few. And Bill Bradley says, is Starbucks pulling the ploy of paying more at the non-unionized stores? That is another way capitalists like to undermine unions. They absolutely are. And they're also doing it like during union drive. So, the things like, oh, we're raising pay or we're increasing benefits. But if you sign up for the union, if y'all unionize at this store, you're not going to be subject to that. It's a really, really nasty anti-union tactic that they're doing. Again, going back to the argument that, like, they're worried about it all. Don't get me wrong, but they would rather pay like a small one-time increase in wages to workers than have to deal with a union permanently, which is why they're willing to sort of even pump money into wages for non-union stores to sort of curtail the unionization rate at Starbucks. And if Biden and the NLRB had any balls, they'd be pushing back against this a lot more than they have been, because it's a very clear union busting tactic. Our good friend, congressional baseball fan, says, I'm an economist, and I'll be the first to tell you that it's more of a pseudoscience than astrology. I mean, it's one of those things you can make a nice argument, as Yellen did, for why you should immiserate an entire class of people in this country. It's pretty good, Dakota. I know I had one from Jay up there, but I wanted to see if I can get to the bottom of this before we change subjects. Chief Running says, aren't banks nationally regulated and insured by the government? Well, your deposits are insured up to a certain amount. And there's regulations on banking for sure. Limited. That's been changing a lot. It's been changing a lot in the past 20 years, 30 years. It was a big part of the financial crisis in the first place. The rolling back of certain regulations on banks and their financialization. I mean, look, we need public banking at a certain point. If anything, just to insulate us from the speculation that the banks are doing with your money. The Federal Reserve, the role of the Federal Reserve is, in a perfect world, is to sort of prevent collapse by being able to loan money out to banks whenever there's a crisis. But as we see, the Federal Reserve has a secondary understanding of their role, which is to participate in class war. So just to be really clear, we did a video on this a little while ago. I actually think it was a Griscom stream on the Fed, so I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but if you just do Left Reckoning, David Griscom, Federal Reserve, or David Griscom Fed, you can find it. And I really break down the Federal Reserve System because I do think there's a lot of misunderstandings about it. The Federal Reserve, we know what it is. It's not something that operates in our interest, but there's a lot of misunderstandings about what it is. And, you want, at least in the system we have right now, some form of central banking, which, again, technically, I know the Federal Reserve is not a central bank, but it functionally operates as one. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check out that video. And Evan says wages are necessary, but union membership means job security and better wages, hopefully, which is way more important to me. I mean, that's the thing. Is like they're happy to give at times temporary increases to wages, but they're much more worried about workers' power for the reasons we've been outlining throughout this whole stream. Okay. So I think I told Jay I was going to answer their question. I'm going to answer that, and then I might have to run, folks. We'll be back with Matt Huber next Tuesday. We're going to be talking a little bit about, left environmental politics, what's going on post IRA. The Inflation Reduction Act, and what happened to the Green New Deal coalition that we were hoping was going to happen. But Jay Zeroni says, off topic, but if we were going to explain to a regular person why being a landlord is a BS job and why sympathy for their plight might be artificial, basically just demystifying landlord's role. I mean, look, if you want to talk about something that is extremely unproductive, sitting on rents is extremely unproductive. You go into work, you produce something that has value to the markets, but it actually has actual use value, has value to people. If you produce food, people eat that food. If you do services for people, that helps out. If you produce good for consumption, or work at an auto manufacturing plant or anything, right? You go to work and you produce something that has value and improves society. Landlords don't produce anything. They don't even produce the house, right? They own it, and they take a quarter of your income, oftentimes more than that. For that, it's a huge waste of resources to sort of have this artificial mediator in between people and a fundamental human need, which is housing. It's one of those things that's like natural in the sense of like we grow up with it, it. But when you really think about it from like a large scale level, it's not an activity that produces very much value in society. In fact, more often than not is used for speculation, increasing the housing costs for everybody else. That'd be a kind of general understanding of if that's what you're getting at. But folks, I'm going to run. I'll be back. We'll be back on Tuesday with Matt Huber. And actually, if you like this kind of stuff, we're doing our bonus episode this weekend on part 2 of Rosa Luxemburg's Reformer Revolution, where she's sort of pushing back against some of the more reformist tendencies on the left at her time, which, seem to be very, very making a resurgence again today. So part 2 of that will be up for patrons. You can subscribe at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Part 1 is already up for non-patrons, so you can find that right after this if you want. But until then, everyone, take care. Look out for yourself and look out for each other, and see you soon.